John Hook's Newsmaker starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker. Tonight, making sure elections are safe and secure for voters and election workers. It's a cornerstone of the work being done by a group called Pillars of the Community, dedicated to restoring trust in our election. And this brought together two guys from very different political backgrounds, Bauer and Ben Ginsberg. Now, Bob was the White House counsel to President Obama. Ben was the national counsel to the George W. Bush presidential campaigns and played a central role in the 2000 Florida recount, which ended with Bush v. Gore, as you know. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Great to see you. Bob, I'm going to start with you. AP poll earlier this year found that only 44% of Americans had a great deal or quite a bit of confidence in the vote count that it will be accurate this year. Only 22% of Republicans have a great deal of confidence compared to 71% of Democrats. How did we get here?
We have had a ceaseless battering of confidence in the election now over the last several years. I think we can talk in nonpartisan terms about the fact that the current Republican nominee didn't concede the last election, has insisted that he won it, and has repeatedly argued that the election is rigged. I think that's clearly his position. He stated it explicitly. And so over time now, and with both the support of the Republican Party and also organically developed groups that have concerns about the integrity of elections, there has been a lot of communication, and I think very misplaced, about holes and weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the electoral process that has resulted in the diminished public confidence that you're pointing to.
Ben, you're politically on the other side of Bob, but you agree on this issue. And you said in 2020, this was a crack up to me. It's funny if it weren't so true. Proof of systemic fraud has become the Loch Ness monster of the Republican Party. People have spent a lot of time looking for it, but it doesn't exist. Doesn't exist at all, or doesn't exist on a level that would have changed any elections?
Doesn't exist on a level that would have changed any elections. I mean, look, John, Donald Trump and his supporters filed 64 court cases after the 2020 election. In none of them could they produce any evidence of systemic fraud that would have changed the outcome of an election. In point of fact, there are bad apples in politics like everywhere else. There is occasional people who do things wrong, but the system manages to catch them. And again, given ample opportunity to present evidence of this mystical fraud, it's not come up.
Yeah, and I've got to point this out because, there's been a lot of piling on of Donald Trump on this, and a lot of that is justified. But let's point out, just for fairness, Democrats such as Hillary Clinton, Georgia governor candidate Stacey Abrams, and dozens of Democratic House members have objected to state and federal election results and have attempted to block certification. Now, Ben, you know this with Bush. There were plenty of Congress people, Jamie Raskin, Barbara Lee, Maxine Waters. They refused to certify or said they would not vote in confidence of the 2000 election or the 2004 election. They were conscientious objectors to the outcome.
Yeah, they were. And it's a tactic that's been mentioned on both sides. It's worth pointing out that 2020 resulted in a riot at the Capitol. And so there's probably a difference between objecting and not objecting. But in any event, it is clear from a newly passed law in 2020 that members of Congress just don't have the right to be able to act as judges of the election. That's a process that's done on the state level through the certification process, the recount process, the contest process, and litigation. And once that signed certificate of ascertainment gets to the Capitol in the presidential election, it is a ceremonial function from there with only a few limited circumstances.
So they couldn't have done much anyway. Even if they objected and made speeches on the floor, it doesn't mean anything.
No, they can always make speeches on the floor.
And they all do. Okay, Bob, distrust in U.S. elections, outcomes, and we talked about this actually before we started taping today. This goes back, this is kind of an American thing, distrust in elections. 1800s, Tammany Hall, go up to the Chicago machine in the 50s and 60s. There has always been a little bit of worry about falderall in elections among Americans, and part of that is because it's very decentralized. Each state does it, they all do it differently, and then within those states, the counties do it differently sometimes.
That's correct. But I do want to, and you mentioned 2000 earlier, I do want to note a significant turning point in the administration of elections and in public confidence in elections, and that was the Florida 2000 elections. At that point, it was understood that the election system really required professional overhaul. We replaced these notorious punch card machines with their hanging chads, and the Election Assistance Administration was created to provide guidance to state and local governments on the best possible management of their election systems. And so we've got a tradition that has developed here, a long now since 2000, and I think intensifying commitment to the professional administration of elections. And what Ben and I discovered, beginning with our co-chairmanship of President Obama's Commission on Election Administration in 2013, we discovered traveling around the country that we do have a cadre of professionals across the country who are really committed to the professional management of the elections process. And so we have this irony that when professional administration of the elections is at its apex, public confidence is increasingly at a low point. And that is a problem that we just have to address, because the public can have confidence in the professional management of elections. And let me just add, that doesn't mean candidates can contest the outcome of elections, seek recounts, disagree with the outcome. There are processes for that in every state. But the fundamental structure of our elections processes, far from being rigged or flawed from top to bottom, permitting millions of illegal votes to come in, is professionally and meticulously managed by Democrats and Republicans alike in responsible positions around the country.
Well, Ben, Bob put it very well, that there is the right of the candidates to challenge results. There are processes for that in court. You were part of that in Bush v. Gore in 2000. Do you believe that's where this divide started? Bush v. Gore 2000, when it ended up in the Supreme Court and them ruling that Bush won Florida and he won the election?
It certainly accelerated with 2000. That was an unusual experience. There was a lot of litigation. People got very revved up after that about the legal process coming in. Of course, there have been contests for as long as we've been a country, and recounts where Bob and I first met in 1984 on opposite sides of a recount. So that the protestation of elections is nothing new. But 2000 put it in a spotlight. And from there, there's been an awful lot of litigation around it.
I want to raise a question for both of you. A lot of this questioning, and particularly in Arizona, has centered around mail-in ballots. And there is this sense among some that whenever you separate a ballot from a voter, it opens a door at least to problems. Somebody intervening, a mail carrier not delivering it, somebody destroying it, somebody tearing it open, whatever, somebody grabbing it out of the box and trying to forge one. People dream up all kinds of things because the system is a little bit mysterious. Do you think, on balance, for what we've gotten in terms of participation and convenience, we've given up a certain amount of security to the ballot and the old precinct model? Bob, I'll let you start on that one.
No, I don't think we've given up anything at all, really. I think, of course, if the ballot isn't delivered by the post office, there's a way of determining that that's the case and working with election officials to ensure that an eligible voter receives the ballot that they can lawfully cast. But I would encourage anybody who has doubts, and Ben and I have been working with election officials and community leaders to invite the public in all these states to closely examine the system. Once that ballot is received, there are rigorous procedures for ensuring accurate receipt, dated receipt, careful safeguarding of secrecy, accurate tabulation. There are really exhaustive procedures, and election officials will walk anybody who wants to walk in and ask for that explanation and wants to see how it works will find election officials prepared to show it to them, and I think they'll be very impressed by that.
I was thoroughly impressed. I did a story on the Maricopa County mail-in vote with Stephen Richer, followed a ballot from start to finish. And what I couldn't and didn't appreciate, Ben, I'll go to you on this, was how many people, partisans, hardcore partisans from each party and independents were watching every step of the process, and they're encouraged to raise their hand and object if they see anything that looks funky. Can you talk about that, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. Arizona has one of the most stringent verification processes in the country for absentee ballots. I mean, it's not like you just get a ballot in the mail and get to send it back. You need to authenticate who you are to receive the ballot in the first place. Then there are tracked barcodes that you have on that ballot to send it in. Voters in Maricopa can actually trace the progress of their ballot. They can either put it in the mail, and they can even go so far as to walk in the ballot to election headquarters, including on election day. Once that ballot gets into the central count location, then it's verified once again with the voter. The signature verification processes that you have, I've been very impressed with. You have bipartisan teams that take a ballot, open the ballot, read the ballot, put it through the voting machine, so that actually it is a safe and secure system. So it is understandable that people say, well, wait a minute, this, I got this ballot and anybody could do anything to it. But in fact, the checks and the safeguards in the system make it that not anybody can do anything to your ballot.
That is precisely what I found. The only caveat might be signature verification, and every state does that a little bit differently. Some of the states in the last election who didn't have a great experience or a deep experience with mail-in voting. I'm thinking Pennsylvania, but you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong on that. Arizona's had a long history with this. We've been doing it since the 90s. But you do wonder, the only vulnerability that I see would be if you get flooded with mail-in ballots and you start to loosen maybe the signature verification safeguards. That's the only thing I can think of.
Well, Bob and I have talked to election officials in all the states, and what they've uniformly told us is that our job is to get it right as opposed to get it quick. And so I think that they are dedicated to the proposition that you don't start easing up on those verification requirements.
When we come back on Newsmaker, I want to get both of your takes on the threats now to election workers, which has become commonplace. The number of election workers and volunteers bowing out is remarkable. We're back with Bob Bauer, Ben Ginsberg, and their expertise on trying to reform, in a sense, our election integrity and talk about how we can get people's trust back. We're back with Bob and Ben in a moment. Back with Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsberg. As you know, Bob was White House counsel to President Obama. Ben was the national counsel to the George W. Bush presidential campaigns, played a central role in the 2000 Florida recount, and they are now members of Pillars of the Community, which is a group dedicated to trying to restore voter confidence in the election process. Thanks again for being with us, gentlemen. We appreciate it. Are you seeing now, Bob, are you seeing schools and churches start to bow out of wanting to be part of being a precinct because people are afraid, institutions are afraid, they don't want potential violence? People are on edge about this election.
No question that election officials in particular have faced extraordinary challenges, both challenges to their professionalism from hostile partisans, but also personal threats and attempts to intimidate. And I should mention, Ben and I also co-chair an organization entitled the Election Official Legal Defense Network, purely bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans who are committed to ensuring that we provide election officials who don't have it protections, legal defense in circumstances where they do face those kinds of challenges. We've seen retirements, early retirements, and resignations of an unprecedented scale because the work of election officials has been so heavily burdened and endangered by this kind of behavior, this sort of challenging behavior across the country. It's really unfortunate because, as I mentioned to you earlier, these are professionals. They have professional associations. They're continuously involved in improving the work that they do. They're transparent with the public about the work. They want to bring the public into that work. And we just cannot have election administration by intimidation. We have to have professional election administration that people come to understand and respect. And that is a problem right now, unprecedented in scope. We haven't seen anything like this in recent decades, and it has to be addressed forcefully.
Ben, do you worry about one side or the other losing and having a complete meltdown? Because you hear this about the right will completely come unglued, but you hear it about the left as well.
Yeah, you do. I mean, it is a worry, and I think that election officials and others are certainly planning for it. But what's really important to remember about our elections and the way they're administered is that we made a policy decision 240 years ago to make it really locally controlled so that the people who are letting you into the polling place and verifying your identity and counting your ballots are all members of your community. They're your neighbors. And that is a positive feature of the American electoral system. And really, when you talk about election officials and workers being harassed, that's really one of the detrimental parts of it because they are your friends and neighbors who are involved.
Let me ask you, Bob, one of the big questions that comes up among doubters, are non-citizens voting? And if they are they in numbers that matter?
They are not. First of all, let me just cite the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which was completely bipartisan. Ben and I had faced off in the 2012 presidential campaign. He was general counsel to the Republican nominee, Mitt Romney. I was general counsel to the campaign of President Obama's re-election campaign. Our commission spent a year studying these issues, and what we discovered is what all the studies show, and that is that fraud in our elections of whatever kind, non-citizen voting fraud, partisan voting fraud, whatever it may be, is extremely rare and certainly not systematic, sufficient, as Ben said earlier, to affect the outcome of elections.
Well, this is what Ken Block told me on this very program. Ken Block did a deep dive in this as well. He was hired by the Trump people to find fraud, and he couldn't find any. And he wrote a book about it, and he told them up front, he said, I'm going to look, but I got to tell you, I'm not sure you're going to find what you're looking for, at least not in those kind of numbers. Ben, quick thing, I'm sure you know, Arizona, and this is broken in the last few weeks, we've got about 218,000 voters who have not provided proof of citizenship. Many of them got under the wire because they got licenses before 1996. Nobody really went back and checked. It's 5% of Arizona voters. Now, the interesting thing is, of that universe, 38% are Republicans, 27% are Democrats. So it's not, if Republicans complain about it, it's really their vote, a large portion of their voters in that universe. Is that something to worry about?
Well, I don't think it is because both parties know the situation. It's been litigated by the courts. I mean, we are a rule of law country, and certainly Republicans believe in the principle of the rule of law. So the court's spoken, and those people get to vote in this election. And I believe there'll be more thorough checks done after that. But no, I don't think it's something to worry about because both parties know the rules of the game right now.
Do both of you agree that non-citizens should not be voting in American elections? Do you both agree with that?
Yes.
Federal law prohibits it. I mean, people have some notion that non-citizens can vote in federal elections, and they cannot. So it's not a question. That choice has been decided at the federal level, and we don't have an allowance for non-citizens to participate in the election of our president.
Well, they have
John, there's one part of that argument that that's really puzzling, which is if you're a non-citizen and you go in to cast your lone ballot, you're putting yourself before governmental officials. And if they find out you're a non-citizen, you go to jail and are likely deported. So is casting one ballot amongst the several million that you've got in Arizona not going to impact an election? Is that like actually worth it to anybody?
Well, let me ask you this, because if you think about that, Ben, since you've been on the inside of campaigns, was that ever a universe of voters that you worried about?
No, absolutely not. I mean, it was, as Bob says, against the law for non-citizens to vote. And so in the normal checks of who's registered and who's not, and who's coming into a polling place, you got to be a citizen to register to vote. So no, it was never, certainly not a universe anybody went after, nor one that campaigns I've been associated with worried about, because again, there was no real proof that it was happening. So why waste the time and the resources on it?
Bob, let me ask you about this idea of foreign attempts to get into our elections. The systems in Maricopa County, for instance, are offline. They are not connected to the internet at all. Is there any way that you can see that foreign actors can interfere in our election process?
I worry, but you're quite right to say that the concern that they could hack into systems is misplaced. They can't do that. And for the reasons that you just indicated, these systems are offline. They can't get to the vote count, change the vote count. I do worry about misinformation and disinformation that is fomented by, encouraged, amplified by foreign government sources. One of the concerns that everybody should have is that false reports are going to begin to circulate about polling places collapsing, illegal voting, whatever it may be. And of course, with AI and other technological tools, there's the ability of those who engage in fabricating those messages to put together misleading images to support the misinformation. And that is going to create a problem. And the media has a responsibility, as do the parties, to refer these questions before they become hot rumors and begin to circulate as hard fact. Just refer those questions to election officials. And they're the ones who know what's happening. And they're the ones who can answer questions about whether anything problematic or disruptive has occurred at the polls. But I am worried about that as a source of foreign government interference in the elections process.
We got about a minute left. Ben, if there were any vulnerabilities to our election system, what would it be?
I think the vulnerability is a human one in the way we have our election system. You want to be sure that the processes in the polling place are observed and that every citizen who has the right to vote gets to cast that ballot without interference in the polling place.
Bob, you want to handle that one too?
Certainly misinformation that misleads voters about access to the polls, that interferes with their right to vote, would be one. And the other thing that we have to look out for is disruptive behavior at the polling place itself, physical disturbances at the polling place, challenger activity that isn't conducted within the bounds of state law. And that is something that we need to be concerned about. But I do think election officials have that problem in hand.
Ben, do you think you're making progress, you and Bob? You've been at this for a while, pillars of the community, trying to restore election confidence. Do you think you're making progress?
We believe we are. We have really been gratified by the diversity of political views who have joined pillars of the community and kicked the tires of the election system and stood up for it. But it's a fair question because all of this is a one-day sale, right? And you don't know how successful you ultimately are until November 5th. But we do believe that we are making progress because we found people of goodwill across the political spectrum in your community and the other battleground states to come together.
Well, when you get out there, the one thing you do realize is Americans are great people, and 99% of them are great folks. Bob Bauer,
Yes.
Ben Ginsberg, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and we really appreciate you both coming on Newsmaker. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Great to see you both. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay.
you. Bye-bye.
We're back in a minute on Newsmaker. Thanks again for tuning in. It was a very interesting show. Appreciate both of those gentlemen. That was fun. We'll see you next week on Newsmaker.